Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip has to do with the difference between a mutual termination agreement and a unilateral notice to terminate, and when one would be more appropriate than the other. So let's get started. This is in the GAR, the Georgia Association of Realtors purchase and contract package. There are two ways a party may terminate a purchase and sale agreement. One is with a notice to terminate, and that is unilateral. Anytime you hear the word notice, that is unilateral, meaning it only requires one party's signature. Unilateral means one, like a unicycle only has one wheel. In the RE forms contract package, there is the notice to terminate, and now you know that means it only requires one party's signature. In the GAR contract package, there is also a mutual agreement, termination agreement form that is not in existence in the RE forms contract package. So, the whole discussion that I'm going to get into really only pertains to the GAR contract package, the forms available in the GAR forms, because in the RE forms there is only a unilateral termination notice where either the buyer or the seller terminates a purchase and sale agreement. So, in the GAR contract package, Georgia Association of Realtors forms, when would you use a mutual agreement to terminate and when would you use a unilateral? So, let me actually go over the forms with you. So in the, okay, now let me find the forms so I can read them to you. The mutual agreement to terminate purchase and sale agreement and disperse earnest money is GAR form F519. And in essence, what this says is if there is going to be a termination of a purchase and sale agreement, it requires four signatures. Four sets of signatures. It requires the signatures of all the buyers. It requires the signatures of all the sellers. And it requires the signatures of the buyer's broker and the signatures of the seller's broker. So in essence, what a mutual agreement to terminate a purchase and sale agreement is an out-of-court settlement statement. In other words, this is if there is an issue financially or a potential issue financially among the parties, the buyer, the seller, or either one of the brokers who have a claim on commission. For example, if the termination is happening by default by one of the parties, then this would be a great form to use so that all of the money can be negotiated up front with the termination. What happens to the earnest money? Is there part of it going to the buyer, part of it going to the seller? And are there any commission payments or partial commission payments being paid to either the seller's broker or the buyer's broker? All of this gets negotiated, gets documented on this form, and signed by everyone. And what this does is this prevents, it says, let me go back and read what it says. In essence, it says that once everybody has signed this form, buyers, sellers, and both brokers, it does release the buyer and the seller from any claim to a real estate commission or other compensation arising out of the agreement. Buyer and or seller do hereby agree to pay the brokers the amounts. It basically eliminates any potential to pursue one of the parties for the termination of this agreement. So the other thing it does is it does officially or contractually end buyers and sellers' obligations with respect to the contract. So it is definitely a good idea to use the mutual termination. If there is, again, if one of the parties is going to terminate by default, and there's a potential, you think there's going to be potential issues with the money between the buyer and the seller regarding the earnest money, or between any of the brokers regarding any commission. So that would definitely be a great idea to use it then. Even if if one of the parties is terminating and there's going to be no issues over the money, it's also probably a good idea to use this mutual termination. Again, it puts everything out there in writing that all parties agree to terminate. All parties agree to what the disbursement of earnest money is. The brokers can put $0 for commission. And it's just a clean final ending to any party's claims of anything with respect to the contract. When would you not use it? Well, before I go back to that, one more thing that I need to read to you regarding this mutual termination is the purchase and sale agreement is not terminated until all four of those parties sign, until you have all buyer signatures, all seller signatures, and both brokers' signatures. And it says on there that this mutual agreement shall only become effective upon it being signed by buyer and seller, with a fully executed copy of the same being delivered to the buyer, seller, and holder, and all amounts, if any, owing to the buyer's broker and the seller's broker being paid in full, and the mutual agreement being signed by the brokers involved in the transaction. So again, the important thing is, if one of the parties initiates a mutual termination of the purchase and sale agreement, the contract is not terminated until you get all of those things happen. You get all four parties' signatures. So why would you not use it? Well, if you have a buyer, if you're working with a buyer and the buyer needs to terminate a contract prior to the end of a contingency time frame. For example, let's say that you have a 10-day due diligence period for the buyer, and the buyer needs to terminate and send notice of termination to the seller prior to 11:59 p.m. on that last day of due diligence in order to protect their earnest money, then in that situation, you absolutely want to use the unilateral notice of termination, not the mutual. Because if your buyer is trying to meet a contingency deadline where they have termination rights and protection of their earnest money, and they send over this mutual termination, but the seller doesn't sign it, the buyer has never terminated the deal, and their earnest money is at risk because they may go over that contingency time frame deadline. So if that's the situation, you would want to use the unilateral notice to terminate. And in the GAR contract package, the unilateral notice is GAR form F522. Unilateral notice to terminate the purchase and sale agreement and the proposed disbursement of earnest money. In the RE forms, it is RE form 263, notice to withdraw or terminate. And again, remember, every time you hear the word notice, it is unilateral. There's only one party whose signature is required to give notice to the other party of something going on. Parenthetically, while we're here in the RE forms contract package, RE form 212 is the agreement to disperse the trust funds. In the GAR contract package, the form F522 is the unilateral notice to terminate and proposed disbursement of earnest money. So this gets a little bit confusing for agents using the GAR contract forms, because the termination of a contract and the disbursement of the earnest money are two completely separate contractual issues. GAR, however, has both of these issues on one form, but they are two completely separate things. Once a contract is terminated, for example, a seller can turn around and put the property back up for sale, even if there is a disagreement or dispute over the disbursement of the earnest money. So you only need one signature to terminate a contract, but you do, per the contract and per license law, need both buyer and seller signatures in agreement regarding the disbursement of the earnest money. But again, once it's terminated, a seller can turn around, even if there's a disagreement and you don't get the seller's signature on the agreement to disperse earnest money, that resolving that issue is a separate issue from the termination of the contract. Now, GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors, for this year, 2021, they have a brand new form that is F290, and it is called Agreement to Reinstate a Contract. I have a whole nother video on this that I will link below. This would be a situation where a buyer and seller have terminated a contract and they want to revive it and bring it back to life. Just quickly, like I said, I've done a whole video in depth on this form and I will link it below, but quickly, there's a lot of times when a buyer will terminate under a financing contingency or an appraisal contingency because the appraisal has come in lower than the contract sale price. But the buyer has and the seller have put in for an appraisal review, but that process is taking longer than the appraisal contingency time frame. So in order to protect the earnest money, the buyer will terminate based on the low appraisal. And then after that, they'll get the appraisal review back and they raise the appraisal price. And so they want to reinstate the contract rather than writing a whole new contract because the lender would need to operate on this contract. So there is that situation, and I just wanted to briefly mention that because you will see that in the contract package form. But the point of this video is you absolutely want to use the unilateral notice to terminate when a buyer is required to send notice of termination before the expiration of a contingency in order to protect their earnest money. In other situations, because that does terminate the contract. If you use the mutual termination, you are required to get all of those signatures before the deal is actually terminated. So comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and I hope this contract tip helps you out. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.